What the heck does an obscure Star Wars game from 2002 have to do with one of the most significant advances in the PlayStation 5 hacking scene to date? Well, sort of everything. If you've never heard of Star Wars Racer Revenge, don't worry, you aren't alone. I myself just found out about it a couple of weeks ago after news of a major leak began circulating the internet regarding BootROM keys for the PlayStation 5. This news threw people into quite a stir of excitement, and reasonably so. You could sort of think of this as an Indiana Jones moment where he finds the golden idol, except instead of Indiana Jones, it's someone who hasn't seen the sun in weeks, and the folder is Sony's legal team. But what about Racer Revenge, and what even are BootROM keys, and why do they matter? Allow me to explain. Originally released in 2002, Star Wars Racer Revenge is centered around pod racing on various planets throughout the Star Wars universe, each with its own group of tracks in which you'll find yourself competing against other racers to try and take first place. Now, I've never actually played this game, and like I mentioned, didn't even know it existed. However, I was able to cop the original Star Wars Racer, which came out in 1999, as part of the last few Games with Gold to drop from Xbox, and to be honest, it's pretty fun, and also terrifying. Aside from its PlayStation 2 launch in the early O's, Racer Revenge would see a digital resurfacing on the PlayStation 3 and 4 online store in both 2015 and 2016. There was also a limited physical release of the game by Limited Run Games in 2019 for the PS4 with only 8,500 units made available. That was the last we ever saw of this game until the tail end of 2025, when it made headlines and changed the PlayStation 5 hacking landscape as we know it. But how? On December 31st, 2025, prominent member of the PlayStation 5 modding community, Brutal Sam, decided to launch his own fireworks for the new year by posting the actual hex strings of the leaked BootROM keys to X. This post was quickly taken down for violating the terms of service, but was soon afterwards validated by another member of the community who goes by Shadzy1. Aside from this confirmation, the removal of the post by X serves as a signal that this was a legitimate leak. Okay, cool, but what are BootROM keys? BootROM keys are immutable code, etched into the silicon itself, and serves as the starting point for what is known as the chain of trust. Like pretty much all modern consoles, the PlayStation 5 utilizes a chain of trust for validating each stage in the boot process, starting with the BootROM and ending with the userland stage. It is meant to ensure that only Sony-signed code can run and thus prevent untrusted or unsigned firmware from booting. This process takes place the moment you turn on your console. In this context, the BootROM keys act as the root of trust and thus serve as a critical security function for the entire chain. You could think of them like the master key said to a vault. Meant to be inherently trusted by design, the subsequent process just briefly described here relies upon the root of trust not being compromised to maintain security and trust the whole way through. And remember, these keys are hardware burnt, thus they are unpatchable via a traditional firmware update. So really, the only fix for Sony would be to replace the APU itself in your console, and good luck getting people to do that. It's important to keep in mind that this leak does not break the chain of trust outright or immediately allow arbitrary code execution at boot, but rather serves as a roadmap to decrypting, reverse engineering, and studying the security architecture of the PlayStation 5. So does this mean we can load up any custom firmware we want? Not yet, but this will surely expedite the process for the homebrew community to achieve a full jailbreak. So while not as earth-shattering as the PS3's cryptographic mistake that busted the console wide open for hackers to take advantage of, this does put a critical crack in the armor of the PS5's security integrity. Tying this all together, we now return to our old friend Star Wars Racer Revenge. Serving as the primary entry vector for pulling off this exploit, the key here is with the PS2 emulator wrapper or sandbox that the game itself is running in. Specifically, this is a critical buffer overflow vulnerability that utilizes player names from the save data, which copies into a fixed 22-byte buffer without length checks. This means that if the record name in the save data is extended beyond, say, 256 characters, you can execute your own arbitrary code to break out of the sandbox and thus carry out a userland exploit. If the arbitrary code contains a malicious payload, then the BootROM keys can be dumped and obtained, which is obviously what happened here. A couple things to note. First, for those who may not know, buffers are sequential sections of computing memory that hold data temporarily as it is transferred between locations. Thus, a buffer overflow occurs when the amount of data in the buffer exceeds its storage capacity. The extra data carries over into other locations and can overwrite existing data. Second, this exploit specifically occurs in the Hall of Fame feature of the game, which lets you view player records like best lap time and knockouts. And third, while the actual nitty-gritty details of how this exploit is done is above my pay grade, it is actually chained with other prior documented techniques that permit full breakout from the emulator sandbox. There's quite a bit of information out there on how to do this yourself, and whether or not you intend to do it, it's still cool to read about how it works in detail. Quick heads up though, this only works on firmware 12 or below, so you may want to disconnect your system from the internet or at least stop automatic updates from occurring on your system before Sony attempts to make it more complicated to pull off. At this point, Sony finds itself between a rock and a hard place. To reiterate, this cannot be fixed by a firmware update. Attempting to alter aspects of the chain of trust or boot process could cause serious complications or stop the console from booting altogether. So that is not an option. They could delist Star Wars Racer Revenge from the PlayStation Store, but this is unlikely and still would not solve the issue in totality. Patches to the actual PS2 emulator that the game is ran in is also extremely unlikely. Whatever solution they may be pondering, the only real fix that truly resolves the issue is a hardware revision via new APUs for the models they produce moving forward. So the long and short of it is, if you have a PS5 currently and plan to take advantage of this exploit or hold out for some good old homebrew, you may want to sit tight and not update your system any further. It may also eventually become an asset if they really do change out the APUs and subsequent BootROM keys for new models, thus making older models more desirable. Speaking of assets, if you happen to be one of the 8,500 individuals who own a physical copy of Racer Revenge, you have the chance to sell it for sky-high prices. After news of the leak dropped, copies of the game began selling for as high as $500, but there seems to be an average cost now of around $200 or so. If you are looking to get a copy for yourself, I'd suggest just downloading a digital version, which runs for $10 and is still compatible with the exploit. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years with the homebrew community for the PS5 as developers and researchers continue to chip away at its security. And if this teaches us anything, perhaps it's okay to hold on to those old, obscure games from 20 years ago because, who knows, it may just be the key to the next big data leak. With all that said, guys, I hope you liked what you saw and perhaps even learned something along the way. I think I may try and pivot to more videos like this, blending cybersecurity and video games together. So let me know what you think down below. But until next time, peace and God bless.